everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I am going to get a mic so that if you have difficulty hearing me right now, it'll get better as soon as we get the mic. Is it better if I get a mic? Yes? Yes. Okay. I'm sorry.
You're present.
Oh, okay. Just a minute about what I'm about to present this morning before we get started. I lived the experience I'm going to talk about today, but the case has been developed with alternative names in every case and a slight shift in job titles and actual participants in order to ensure that it is not possible to identify the actual participants in this case. So when we get finished, I'm happy to answer any questions about this, but I am going to present it as the case that it is. I've been working with two professors at the University of Maine School of Business. This is, in fact, a case developed for business ethics classes. And so while we're offering it today, it is very much intended for business ethics discussions. And it has just been accepted for presentation at a conference at St. John's University in late October, and they will be continuing to develop this for a teaching tool in business ethics. So let's think about the time frame of this case, which was actually 2006. It was a period of really bad behavior in the American business environment. So if you recollect, these are names and faces that we saw in the news all the time. And as a person who was at that time active in the Boston business community, I have to say it was a bad time to be in the business world. From the point of view of people thinking that no one in business could be trusted for anything. And all of these people that we are looking at were at the very tops of their companies. They were not people who had migrant roles. So if you think about this as the time frame, let's remember that these individuals committed crimes, white-collar crimes, that ended up with jail sentences, many of them very lengthy, 25 years or more. And in some cases, these people may truly, in fact, die in prison because of the length of their sentences. So let's switch gears a little bit and acknowledge that at the same time, there were a next level of scandals going on in the business community, and that's in the sexual harassment arena. Now, sexual harassment rarely rises to the level of jail sentences as the penalty. However, there are sexual harassment cases right now which include rape and murder, which obviously will rise to that level if a conviction comes. But let's face it, for sexual harassment, the ultimate penalty is typically job loss. So at the very time that this case we're going to discuss today was happening, very contemporaneously, the U.S. CEO of Toyota Motors, the U.S. CEO, a Japanese national, but here in the United States, was charged with sexual harassment by his assistant. The company did nothing, and they were sued for $16 million, and the settlement was not full 16, but it was large. He was, by the way, returned to Japan in a much lower level job. At the very same time, a company here in Boston called Keene, a family-owned company that was extremely successful, had also a sexual harassment case involving one of the sons of the founder, who was charged with sexual harassment of the senior individual in the marketing organization. In fact, he claimed that he was not responsible for the charges against him, but Keene settled with her for a very large sum, and he lost his position. And within months, Keene was on the block, up for sale, and it in fact was sold. So the family and the company basically went out of business after this incident. And then, of course, we all remember, slightly in a different environment, in the government, the Foley case of sexual harassment of young interns in the government. So this is the environment that we're talking about as we go into this case. And so the first part of the case, which you have in front of you, it's a two-sided handout, is entitled, "Would You Blow the Whistle on Your Boss?" So can I ask you please to take 2 minutes to read it? It won't take you longer than that. Please take it. Okay. If everyone's read the case now, let me just point out that when you think about a case like this, The real question is, do you take action or do you not? And most people are very convinced that if they take action, something bad is going to happen. So I found this little cartoon 2 years after this all happened, and it was just so perfect because it does express. So many people will say, how can you take action? You know what's going to happen. You're going to lose your job. Well, I just want to be sure to say to you, as one of the specific pieces of the information as a takeaway from this, once you're involved in an actual sexual harassment investigation, it actually is very difficult to remove the employment of someone who is involved in such a case. And I think that tips the scales towards really the moral obligation to pursue the case. In fact, I'd say this is an area of law in the U.S. labor laws that truly has gone much farther than most people understand it has to protect participants in such a case. So while this is the perception, the reality is that people who do, in fact, do what they are supposed to do are protected by the law. And if you remember back to the white-collar crimes that I mentioned earlier in this session, these three individuals, well, two of them in particular, the one on the left and the one on the right, were identified as really critical to solving the underlying responsibilities for the fraud at the various companies. The woman in the foreground was the FBI agent involved with uncovering some of the information that the FBI had prior to 9/11 that was not disclosed in time to prevent that attack on the U.S.
Will you take questions or do you prefer to finish?
I'm happy to take a question.
They can't be fired, but the truth is, doesn't it pretty much limit what any advancement in the company?
Well, you know, of course, I think that is another fear and another concern. It is very, very difficult to do anything that would be in any way retaliatory after an investigation like this has been completed. But surely that's in the eyes of the beholder, and I do think it's a consideration that you have to make. However, you know, as in life, there are always decisions that you have to make that the consequences may be unclear.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through just a couple of steps of ethical decision making, just to kind of lay out a couple of ways to think about this before we get into the questions on this case. So, the notion of moral rights and duties. Again, this is an academic summary for business ethics discussion. And essentially, the idea here is, this is not religious, this is not philosophical, this is a notion of a common morality, that basic human rights need to be recognized in the workplace. And one of those basic human rights is the ability to work free of harassment or interruption in your efforts to do your job. Now, the last comment here, I think, is particularly relevant to this case, which is, in the law, the head of HR has a professional as well as a moral duty to secure a safe work environment. In fact, the head of HR is typically identified as having that role in the corporation, regardless of what the organization is. So it would be difficult for a person in this job to escape responsibility for taking on this kind of challenge. The second consideration is the application of justice. And basically, this gets to the notion of everyone being treated the same regardless of their position in the hierarchy. And this particular thought became very germane in this case because we were talking about the CEO of the organization in an organization that had consistently treated everyone below his level the same for equal infractions of our policies. And then finally, utilitarianism, and that's especially the notion that the greater right prevails. So if you have a difficult balancing act between the rights of one individual versus others, then you're trying to say it's better for the organization as a whole that several people's rights be protected versus one individual. And obviously that's a concept worthy of lots of discussion, but that the general concept is if you're going to protect 4 workers at the cost of terminating one CEO, that's a utilitarian way of looking at the decision. And obviously we need to look at all 3 of these in context. So remember now, if we were having a business ethics discussion, we would spend a lot of time examining these particular ways of looking at the problem and have probably some fulsome debate on how any of you might look at this. But these are the kinds of principles that lie behind the decision making. So, okay, so let's get to the questions specific to this case. You've read what we know up to this point. And the first question is, excuse me, what is the right thing to do? Do we have any thoughts on what is the right thing to do in this case? A hand, please. Yes, ma'am. Investigate. Now, you can see from the case that there has been some investigation. So you're saying investigate the CEO. Go ahead with the investigation of the CEO. Okay. Based on the information in this case, that has been done preliminarily. The typical investigation process would include investigating everyone making the claim, everyone witness to the claim, and then the person who is being charged with the claim, and then making a decision. In this case, we've done the first set of investigations, but not including the person who's being charged. Yes?
They should bring in an independent group.
Bring in an independent group to do the investigation. And they have to do it quickly. They have to do it quickly. Yeah? Yes?
The person bringing the action, getting her own attorney.
The person bringing the action, getting her own attorney. Why do you say that?
Well, I think that having everything done legally is going to end up before a court, right, usually? And
Not usually, actually. Most of the time, these things get settled. Yes. Yeah. Right.
I'll tell you why I taught, and basically that was the first thing they
Get
said.
a lawyer.
If you're going to get, if anybody is going to be ripped, that person should get their own attorney. They get the attorney for school system, but that's really not happening.
Okay.
So they said,
So get your own attorney.
and get it down and present it factually. So
Okay.
emotions are not over.
So it's not like a son-in-law attorney.
No, he's a malpractice.
We're not doing advertising for your son-in-law. Okay. Okay. Anyone else with an idea? Yes. Sarah.
Well, because the person is the CEO over Mary, she would have to go over his head.
You're right. She would have to go over his head. What do you think about that?
Well, that's puts her in a very difficult position.
Yes, it
And
does.
also, if she has to go to the Roman Catholic Diocese, then it's removed from her hands, and she may not be able to affect the case anymore.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, if she goes over his head to the archdiocese, it is removed from her hands and she may not. But, you know, the truth is, it's probably removed from her hands anyway once we're talking about her boss. But you're right, that's the real dilemma there. Any other thoughts about what's the right thing to do?
Here in the back.
Sorry.
If it was not the archdiocese, it would be the board.
The Board of Trustees.
Board of Trustees.
Yes, it would be.
Would that be a different kind of situation?
No, actually, I think there was and is a Board of Trustees in between the CEO and the archdiocese. Yes, there is. Yeah. Okay, all of those are great thoughts. Yes, sir.
What about confronting the alleged perpetrator?
Well, that is in fact, I think, what we're talking about here, investigating or confronting the perpetrator. Exactly right. That's right. That is one of the alternatives. Absolutely. Okay, so what about the next question? How much touching and talking is necessary to be sexual harassment? Based on what you've read in the case, does it seem like sexual harassment to you?
Yes.
Anyone with a contrary point of view dares to raise? Truly, there are contrary points of view, legitimate contrary points of view here. So I'd love to hear it if anyone has one. Yes, Chris.
Were there actually people who did have a contrary point of view?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. People didn't have a contrary point of view. They,
Men or women?
excuse me.
Was it based on whether it was a man or a woman?
No, there were both men and women. Yes, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
one thing that's not mentioned here is did any of the recipients of this unwanted attention turn around and say, "Don't talk to me like that, don't touch me"?
Yeah.
Is that
The question is,
or is
the question is, did any of the women who are at the receiving end of this behavior turn around and say, "I don't want to be treated like this. Don't do this." Yes. The case doesn't tell you that. I can certainly tell you that, in fact, they did not feel they could do that without jeopardizing their jobs. There was I think a classic case of a disparity of power here in this situation that said to them that if they resisted these overtures, they would surely lose their jobs. And they were told things that made them believe that, so they weren't just making it up. Although it's very typical behavior many times in these cases, people presume that if they're in a relationship of power and they perceive themselves to be powerless, that they would take the consequences. Yes?
Who told them that they might? I mean, who told them?
Who told them?
You said that.
They perceived a risk to themselves.
Isn't there usually human resources?
Yes, there is. And in fact, these women had come to human resources. But they had come after a long time of living with this behavior. And they came at a time when they basically were at the end of their rope. In one case, the woman was in fact exiting the organization and revealed this information in her exit interview. The first one who came forward basically was at the end of her rope and thought she had to leave, but took one last chance coming to HR. Yes?
I just have a question. How about whether in this case, which is unique because you've got the CEO, but in general, how much is expected of the person who's being harassed? How much is she would be expected to push back?
Yes. That's a great question.
Right.
The question is, how much is the individual who is alleged to be being harassed, how much responsibility do they have to push back? And of course, every organization, or every good-sized organization, many small organizations don't, but every good-sized organization usually has an espoused policy about this. Typically, the policy is that the burden is on the perpetrator, not on the alleged victim. But the always suggested best approach would be, if you are comfortable enough to say, I don't want you to behave like this, I would prefer that you please just let me do my work. That would always be the recommended first course. The recommended first course is always, please try to handle this if you feel capable. If you don't, then come to someone in a role where they're allowed to participate in protecting you. Now, this is a tricky matter, again, in the eyes of the law, because once a person goes to an official of the company, so let's say this person tries to say, no, I don't like this behavior, and doesn't stop, then the next tack they take is to go, let's say, to the HR organization. And this is very common. I'm coming to you to tell you that I don't like this behavior, but I'm not yet at the point where I want you to do anything about it. So can we just be on notice? Well, no, you can't be on notice. The law says once the company is on notice, the company has an affirmative obligation to investigate. So that also becomes a tricky thing. It's why people wait a long time, because more and more people understand that in order for them to be protected and the company to be protected, it has to be investigated. Now, let me just, yes, sir.
I would just point out that in your comment, you're implicitly granting power and authority to a human resource organization. And I can say that in my travels through corporate America, there are many, many times where HR is viewed as powerless and ineffective. So we would cause one to hesitate bringing them into the equation.
Did everyone hear that I'm implicitly sort of acknowledging some power and authority in the HR organization when in his travels through corporate America, there are many HR organizations that would not either take that power or have that power. And I have to say, sadly enough, I completely agree with you. In fact, and again, I'll sort of digress a little bit. In this particular case, the first person who came forward to complain came forward on a Friday afternoon. 2 days later, in the Boston Sunday Globe, in the work section, there was a front page article in that particular section of the Globe that basically said, if you're having problems with sexual harassment, skip the HR department. So believe me, I thought that was a particularly ironic thing to see, but I think it was absolutely true. The other alternative, however, and again with full protection, is your own line manager and that line of authority. So it is not restricted to the HR organization. I obviously hope for and try to advance HR people that will take responsibility, but you're absolutely right about that. Yes, one more question. Oh, two questions.
So Dr. Gagnon's Lebanese background come into play here. There must be some standard by which you have to the hospital administrator and behavior has been studied, and there must be a standard after so many years in the United States. You
Well, especially when you're born in the United States. You're absolutely right. I mean, you know, the point is, the gentleman is raising the issue of the so-called the Lebanese origin defense. This is a person who was born in the United States, you know, went to high school, university. I won't mention the names because they're all wonderful institutions, so I'm not trying to go there. Yes?
Isn't it true that people in management today are very conscious of improper behavior because it's so many litigious cases?
Yeah, isn't it true that the people in positions of responsibility would be aware of this because there's so much litigation? You would believe that to be true. I believe that to be true. But I have to say, in spite of the fact that, well, look at all the individual white-collar crimes that were arrayed at the beginning, you would think that there would be some vicarious opportunity to learn. But, you know, out of all of that, we got Sarbanes-Oxley because there was the notion that we have to have new rules. If we don't have CEOs who will really say, yeah, I did know that that was our financial condition, and instead say, what, the CFO knew that, but I didn't know that. Well, now they have to know that. So I think, you know, there is a piece here that would say, wouldn't you think people would think that? Or would they think, I don't want that to happen to me, but somehow they don't think it will happen to them. I mean, they really don't. So we'll go to the next question. Does the setting of a Catholic hospital system have any particular ramifications, any special considerations?
You should have known better.
He should have known better. Anyone else with a thought on this? Yes, Betty.
It's very hierarchical.
It is very hierarchical. You're absolutely right about that.
Authority is the authority.
The authority is the authority. I think that's an important point towards the question about do the individuals have the responsibility to say, just don't behave like this? And I think it's certainly reinforced. The hierarchical nature of authority is certainly reinforced. Any other considerations? Yes.
I would say it took twice as much courage to come forward, knowing the patriarchal hierarchy of all this and the history of the archdiocese when it comes to acknowledging sexual issues.
I think that's a great point. The point is that it probably took even more courage for the individuals to come forward because they would understand the hierarchical nature. In fact, very ironically, the last incident that happened to the first victim who came forward happened on a day when the cardinal was actually practically walking by her space. So she was extremely aware, constantly aware of the relationship to the church. Yes, sir.
This also transpired in the mid-stages, if I'm not mistaken, of the whole sexual abuse scandal as well.
Yes.
Was
Yes.
being swept under the rug.
Yes.
In that way.
Yes, that is true. The sexual abuse scandal was just basically not dying down because, you know, we all know that still today there are many people that are involved in suits with the church still over this. But the heated piece that had to do with the departure of Cardinal Law, yes, was still very much on the minds of most people in that environment. And in fact, I think made it, for a lot of the people who observed what went on, they were simply incredulous that another event associated with sexual misbehavior would not be immediately sort of snapped up and dealt with. Okay. How about the victims? What about the victims? Any thoughts as to how you treat the victims in this case? Yes, ma'am.
Maybe she should have told them. Have you ever told Mr. Gagnon
Yes, sir.
that you don't like his behavior and please don't touch me?
Yes. Yes, in fact, she did do that.
She did.
Yes, she did. Any other thoughts about taking care of the victims? Okay, yes, I'm sorry. Is that Wendy?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, a lot of these cases, it's clear that these two might have come forward, but there's a high chance that there are others that have chose not to come forward.
That's
and
right.
so there's protecting those people as well as
That's right.
the next person who might get selected. They
Yes.
get transferred or whatever, disappear. If he has that feeling that that is appropriate and
That's
that's
right.
okay because of his power, he will do it again.
That's right. The notion that if there are two, there may be more. I will tell you that in this case, the first person who came forward literally was what you would characterize it as a he said, she said situation. There were no witnesses. There was one person, a victim, and one person, a potential perpetrator, and we were very straightforward in our conversations about that fact. She knew it, and I knew it. And so what we did, this was a person who was really quite terrified in the workplace. And what we did was construct strategies for her personal safety. And she had my telephone numbers 24 hours a day, even when I left Boston, because she was that afraid of a surprise circumstance that she would not know how to deal with. Now, those safety things came down to things like a strategy for leaving the work area where he would approach, a strategy for putting a chair across her workspace so he couldn't get close to her physically. These are the kinds of things that she was worried about. It was not literally 30 days later that the second person came into my office and said, this is what has happened to me. And so it was no longer a one case of she said, he said. And at that point, obviously, an investigation was necessary. So
So
yes.
you're saying that if it had just been the first case, there's nothing you really could have done except
Continue to monitor, exactly right, until there was something that we either had a witness for, or additional documentation for, or some kind of corroboration. That's right. Yes.
And was there a witness in the second case? Or what?
There was not a witness in the second case, but the second case revealed, to Wendy's point, 3 additional cases, 2 of which had witnesses. Okay? All right. Who are the stakeholders and how are each of them likely affected? So who are the stakeholders? We've already discussed some of them. Obviously the victims, obviously the archdiocese, the church, right. The CEO, anyone else? The HR person. Anyone else?
The company as a whole.
The company as a whole, that's right. I think it's particularly important to think about here the constituency of the company as a whole. If these charges go unaddressed, the company is open to very substantial financial penalties, and those penalties are paid directly out of the coffers of the company. So if you think about this as, well, gee, isn't it disruptive? Doesn't it create financial costs to go through these kinds of things? It does. There's no question about it. But it costs even more to go through an investigation and the penalty phase of this if you're found guilty. And clearly, we had enough evidence at this stage in the game that we would actually have a guilty finding, that we had to be concerned about that. So all the stakeholders have to be taken into account. Any other comments on stakeholders? No. Yes, please. Patience. Absolutely. Patience. Absolutely. You know, we know many things about the patient experience in hospitals, and I must say, my experience for almost 5 years in healthcare is that almost every single provider of healthcare has a very high regard and a very high respect for their obligations to their patients. And that was on the minds of everybody. What will our patients think if they feel that the administration can't be trusted towards its employees? What will they then presume they should think about themselves? And I must say, I never ever worried about that, frankly, because administrators at this level are pretty far away from patient activity. But our patient care was fantastic. So I think it was the providers themselves who were worried about their reputation. Okay. And what should Mary's next step as the human resources professional be? We'll go right to it in the next part of things. But any ideas? Several of you actually suggested that. I think you suggested that she investigate, right? Yes. Okay. So why don't you flip over the page, read the second half of the case, and we'll go from there.
Excuse me, I just have a question.
Yes.
What's the lapse in time between the recording and May 8th?
The previous,
Yeah.
it was about 3 weeks.
Has anyone spoken to the CEO of all this before?
No.
To find out if this,
No.
maybe you're on his side?
No. Yes.
It says here that the May 18th Board of Congress meeting, Mary was invited to the meeting, however, she received a call at 4 p.m. advising she should not attend.
That's right.
Who was the call from and why?
Is everyone finished reading? I just want to make sure. Okay, fine. The call was from the attorney for the archdiocese, and there was no reason why. change of mind. Yes.
Did either of the victims have lawyers at this time? Were they involved in this?
Not at this time. Not at this
So
time.
they were trusting?
Yes.
HR?
Yes, they were. And I will tell you, it was the policy of our organization, and it was the policy of each organization I worked for before this, that we did not allow employees to involve personal attorneys in an internal investigation. So if they had an attorney, that attorney would not be allowed to represent them in an internal investigation, only if they chose to bring an action against us as an organization. And that is very common practice. Let's see, were there other clarification?
Just a follow-up on that, did Mary ever find out on her own why she was asked not to attend?
No, she figured it out though. Yes. Ben.
What was Mary's support to all this?
Well, I say, obviously I'm married, so I hate to be tricky about this. The HR organization and the labor attorney within the organization were incredibly professional and supportive throughout all of this, as was virtually every attorney that worked on either side in terms of doing the right thing. Everyone was eager to do the right thing. So let's go to the questions beyond the clarification questions. So the first one is, should Mary have written the May 8th letters of requirement, and do you agree with the contents? Why or why not?
Yes.
Anybody thinks not? Yes.
I'm just concerned about the time frame.
Yeah.
And to follow up to the woman's question,
Mm-hmm.
when was the new attorney engaged to carry out the investigation?
No, not necessarily clear. What happened, if you read this first paragraph of the case, you see that Ted Summers, who is the attorney for the Archdiocese, makes the decision that an investigation needs to be done of the CEO and recognizes, as we talked about before, that it would be inappropriate for the head of HR who works for that CEO to either initiate an investigation of him or go over his head and solicit an investigation from his bosses. But it was the attorney's responsibility to decide what was the appropriate next action in the organization, what would be the best course of action. Now, the stakeholder here in his mind is the company. Of course, he's representing the company's interests. And he's trying to decide what represents the company's interests the best. And the best representation of the company's interests is to get to the bottom of whether or not the CEO has, in fact, committed these actions that are alleged against him. If yes, then obviously one course of action. If no, then no. Now, when he made that recommendation, the attorney that's then identified, Ellen Bain, was hired, an outside attorney with excellent credentials. Credentials from the MCAD as well as private practice, Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, as well as private practice. Extremely capable person. She redid the whole investigation, interviewed all of the individual complainants as well as the perpetrator, and then made her recommendations. It was after that that the May 8th letter was written, because time was passing after the recommendations came out of that. And during that time, it became clear that there were other lawyers also reinvestigating. And when that became clear, I simply said, I don't think it's going to handle a third round of being investigated. And they said they didn't think it was necessary that they would work with the papers of the previous investigators. In other words, the work papers of the previous investigators. And when actually, subsequently, we actually had a meeting at which I did attend, it was clear that those lawyers were lawyers that had been hired to, in fact, redo the investigation, because they came forward in the meeting. Yes?
Were you able to see what Ellen had put together?
No. We knew her sort of summary findings, but we did not see the contents of her investigation. When I say we, there was another HR professional and I, plus our internal labor attorney working on the case internally. The three of us did not see the results of her investigation or the written recommendation. We just knew the sort of summary recommendation. Yes?
Was the letter written to the Cardinal, and was he considered the chair of the Board of Governors
No.
or the Prime
share? I can't
Yes.
understand why it's been got.
Yes, I'll explain why. The Board of Trustees, the Board of Governors, I'm sorry, Board of Governors, which is the language that the organization uses, has only the authority to pick the chief executive officer, participate in the selection of the chief executive officer and the oversight of his performance and compensation, not the authority either to hire or fire. The only person with the authority to hire or fire is the cardinal.
And what is his role in the corporation?
The Archdiocese owns the organization.
He's a high
Yes.
sheriff.
Right. Other questions? Yes.
Was there any talk ever of a warning?
Yes, it was, in fact.
Once more in there.
Well, the case tells us that there is a direction for a reprimand here. And in fact, that's what came out of the meeting that I was uninvited from. It was and this is in quotes, stern reprimand and the requirement to do some sexual harassment training. Yes.
How did he explain away his questioning about intimate aspects of someone's personal life? Is that also part of women's culture?
The question is, how do you explain away asking about intimate aspects of someone else's life? Is that also part of Lebanese culture? You know, the whole defense, the whole Lebanese culture defense was investigated by a reporter for the Globe who went to a Lebanese community in Watertown, I believe, and spoke with the people there about these statements that he had made. And they said it was absolutely ridiculous to attribute these to his Lebanese culture, that it was a strategy, a defense strategy. And that he didn't try. Yes. Right, exactly. Yes.
At the risk of being stoned, it sounds a little unfair to the CEO.
What sounds unfair?
That nobody has spoken with him yet.
Oh, yes, they have.
Oh, that's
Oh,
what
yes.
happened.
That's what Ellen Bain did.
And I
Ellen
know
Bain.
of 2 cases where the board immediately tried.
No, absolutely not. No. Ellen Bain redid the entire investigation by talking to the women again, but also investigated him.
Before Ellen Bain, had anyone talked to him?
No, because of the dilemma of who would do it. I mean, I couldn't do it as his subordinate, and the archdiocesan attorney couldn't do it because he was also the attorney for the system. So we had to get an independent third party to do it. That's why I made the comment that by the time we were at that stage, the decision had to be made as to what was in the company's best interest, and it was to do a fair and full investigation of the CEO by someone who could be objective in that process. And that's why Ellen Bain was hired to actually do it. Yes?
Did the Cardinal contact you directly to explain why he made the decision he did?
No. Yes?
I see the letter says explicitly that to take whatever actions necessary to offer support and assistance to the victims. Was there any suggestion to these women that they seek counseling or be in counseling regardless of the outcome of the process of the proceedings?
I certainly never made that suggestion. The question that I think that we were looking for there was what kind of support can we give these people while they're uncertain as to what is going to happen to their employment and their safety.
But I'm thinking about their mental health as they sit through this malaise of quagmire and walking into the company every morning and having to deal with the safety issues.
That was what I was certainly concerned about. That you walk a very fine line to suggest that someone might need to get counseling. If they ask for it, then obviously you're in a good position to offer it. But you do walk a fine line. When the decision was made to offer the so-called stern reprimand and sexual harassment training, these women were offered an individual, a priest at the archdiocese, who would be their contact person and who would be their so-called safety net. Should Mary get her own attorney? Should she recommend that the other people get an attorney? Should Mary get an attorney? What do you think? No. Yes. Yes? Yes. And should she recommend that the others get attorneys?
I think they should.
You think they should move them to another department. The women involved, they were in 5 different departments. Right then, okay? So we moved 5 women to 5 different departments. Okay, now, let me just say, yes, sir? Yes.
How aggressive was Mary in pursuing this, and was there an implication that she might be looking for big bucks? And if not, is that why a light reprimand came down?
Okay. No, there was no, a couple of questions I want to make sure we get to. There was no suggestion that these women were looking for financial settlements. They all were looking to stay in their jobs and be free of harassment at the point of the investigation. By the time we got to the stage that they had waited now weeks to hear some kind of a response to their complaints, they were starting to get very angry. And once people start to get angry, all bets are off. They're going to take all sorts of, that's why I said this situation cannot be contained much longer. That was not a threat. That was a statement of what is happening to these people. They're getting very, very anxious. From the point of view of the person who works for the company, it is, I think, never appropriate to suggest that an employee get an attorney unless you are clearly aware that there is going to be some kind of legal action. For me to say, my advice to you ladies is to get an attorney is a pretty inflammatory thing to say. So it was my responsibility to resolve their cases, and that would be basically saying, I'm out, go get an attorney. So no, that is not something that would be a likely alternative at that juncture. Should someone get to a place where we've made our decision and then they say to me, should I get an attorney, which often happens, my usual answer is, it's based on your belief in how much it's worth your money, to pursue this, and your belief in how strong a case we have. And I will always say to people, if I feel we have a strong case, I'm telling you, I believe we have a strong case. And usually people will make their decision based on how much money they're willing to risk. But in this case, I think it would have been only really disastrous to advise them all to go out to get attorneys at that stage. Yes?
Well, as an attorney, I'm always in favor of people hiring someone. That being said, it seems to me that it's early in the process for Mary to be concerned about repercussions on her career so that she would not need an attorney at this stage.
Thank you. I agree with you. Yes, Denise, sorry. Yes.
At the beginning, given that maybe the person did do it, if that person admitted to it right away, what would have happened to him then?
Well, I think that's a great question, Denise. Denise's question is, what would have happened to the individual if he had acknowledged what had transpired? And who will ever know, because he didn't do that. But I think there are clues here as to the answer to that question, because one of the things that you see in some of the coverage of the case, I'm not sure if it's in this or not in this case I just gave you, but one of the things you see in the press is that the cardinal became concerned when there was an outright denial of responsibility. So, and this was after the decision to do the stern reprimand, when he started saying, I didn't do any of this. It's just my Lebanese culture. So if that's a clue, that suggests to me that there would have been more receptivity if he had said, I did this, I don't know why I did it, I won't do it again. I think maybe, yes, maybe. Now, you can argue forever about that because we will never know, but I think there's a possibility. Okay, next question. If the reprimand stands, so if we just end up with a reprimand, what should Mary do? We've got to work with this guy that you just got through this process with.
You're doing your job, so you just keep working.
Keep working. Yep, that's one alternative. What other thoughts? Resign. Another hand over there?
I would probably talk to my peers to determine if there is any, someone else has gone through any kind of similar case, or see, try to learn from a precedent that may have been set. You've got to help guide you what your options are.
Right. Okay, any other ideas? Yes.
Couldn't that be considered a slanderous conversation?
A slanderous
If
conversation?
she's slandering him by talking to her other peers, wouldn't she have to be careful about that?
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I couldn't determine what the degree of risk of slander is. But most of those conversations are pretty confidential, and you wouldn't have them in a very public way. I suppose there's a risk of that, but it actually never came to that, so I really don't know. Okay, yes.
I feel that the decision is in line with what the church did with the priests who abused young boys.
Which part of the decision was in line with what?
That they just reprimanded him. And with the priests, they just shifted them to another parent.
Yes. The point is that the decision to reprimand was in line with the decision to shift priests to other parishes. In other words, no particularly strong consequences, just a mild change in responsibility or shift. Yes?
If the reprimand stood, I would, as Mary would have been attempting to write a long letter, essay, article to the board of governors, the cardinal, everybody in the church, especially in the context of the sexual harassment on Caritas,
Right.
saying this is very
Right. Yeah, I think, well, in fact, a strong part of the letter, I mean, obviously the letter was much longer than just giving you an excerpt here, but it did include a comparison to the pedophile management and a concern about basically repeating that same bad situation. Okay. Assuming that you're a board member, what are your obligations? If you are outvoted on the board, what should you do? I can just tell you that there was one abstention, and there was 100% agreement to the reprimand. So that don't spend a lot of time thinking about if you're outvoted. So think about it. In a business case, we could talk about that because of the board responsibilities, the governance issues associated with that. But just so that, because we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, assume that you're a board member. What are your obligations? Think about that part. Yes. They were all men, except for the woman who was for the first time at a meeting and was the abstention. Yes.
Is the board actually doing advising, or are they just a bunch of rubber stampers for the cardinal?
Does the board actually do any advising, or are they like a bunch of rubber stampers for the cardinal? I honestly think that they do advising. How that translates into what the cardinal takes of that, I don't know. I do think, I know many of these board members very, very well, and I will say they are uncompensated volunteers who give very genuine time and energy. And I don't think it's by any means just sort of like a paper processing. I think they take their responsibilities very seriously and do in fact try to give the cardinal as much counsel as they can. Yes?
When you forwarded your information to the board members when you were uninvited, did you also share your recommendation or your opinion of how it should be handled?
I did. If you think about it, this meeting was to have occurred at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was to have presented all these materials. And because I didn't know why I was uninvited, but I kind of figured out it was because they didn't want me to present materials. I thought, you know what, I have an obligation to these women and to the board members to at least let them know what I would have told them if I had been here. Now, of course, at the meeting, the vote transpired. So I'm at home sending these email materials to their home. Meanwhile, they're voting on this recommendation, which had come from the fourth set of lawyers. After Ellen Bain, 2 more lawyers were engaged, 2 more sets of lawyers were engaged. And the fourth set of lawyers asked for and received our handling of all prior cases and said that we had been draconian in our implementation of our previous sexual harassment cases where we terminated for equivalent levels of touching and kissing, etc., and that it wasn't a fair standard to result in termination. So that's how they recommended a reprimand. Yes?
The obligation of this board could be to preserve the name of the church.
Yes, the obligation of the board could be to...
Given the scandal that has gone on, a reprimand hopefully wouldn't make the front page of the world.
Well, that's right.
And that could well be their obligation.
That could be their intention. The materials obviously made their way to the Globe over the weekend. Everyone somehow presumes that I was the person who sent them. I did not send them the materials. In addition to that, the Globe interviewed, because they received the materials, they interviewed the Cardinal on Saturday, the day after this meeting, the meeting took place on Thursday night. Friday, the women were informed that they had this new individual they could speak to if they had any further problems, and I was informed of that. And I was informed that I had no longer any responsibility for these women. And then on Saturday, the Globe called me to say they had a release from the Caritas that they wanted me to respond to. And I had seen the release. I said, I don't know what you're talking about, so they faxed it to me. And the release basically announced the treatment, the decision of reprimand and the harassment training requirement. And the last paragraph of one of the, close to the bottom, it said, the Board of Governors recommended the Cardinal that a full investigation be done at the Human Resources Organization to ensure that it knew how to do these investigations properly in the future. When I saw that, I thought, okay, I get it. Great, I see where we're going with this, but my hands were tied. God was cast. Yes.
I just want to backtrack a bit. You mentioned about all these different investigations, and Ellen Baines, the objective outside
Yes.
is going to pull everything together. What were the ostensible reasons for asking for the naming two more investigations? I think the handwriting was already on the wall as to how this was going to go.
Well, the particular lawyer who did this work, I think felt strongly that his opinion was correct. I don't think that he was in any way saying anything other than his actual legal opinion. I think, however, one of the letters that was written by, in the Globe, where they did the columns about readers writing, was for an individual that said, well, of course they took the advice of the lawyer, because you always take the advice of your lawyer if you have confidence in them. The question is, how many lawyers do you go through before you find that? Okay. So I'm going to just skip on now to sort of the end of the story, because we are running out of time, and June is telling me that. So on Monday, so Thursday the decision, Friday the women are told, Saturday I learned that the Cardinals have released a statement. Sunday, May 21st, there's an article in the Globe that says, CEO reprimanded, VP of HR, furious. I didn't use the word furious, the Globe did, but there you go. So, that was the first headline. Then it started, because the minute that article appeared in the Globe on Sunday, people started calling and emailing, saying, this happened to me too. And it was not only people who worked for us, but people who used to work for us, people who were their parents, saying, this happened to my daughter, etc. So it basically became an untenable situation. And what then happened was Wednesday, so Monday is the first day, and everybody knows this, Wednesday a special board meeting is called. And we get into this. What ended up happening is that the meeting was held, the board revisited this in light of all of the allegations that were now on the plate. We didn't even have time to investigate all of them, but every single one that we did investigate was legitimate. So by the time we came to the Wednesday meeting and all of this information was out there, the board had no choice, but to re-look at their decision. And when they re-looked at their decision, they made the decision to terminate. Now, I shared this letter with you at some hesitation, but the reason that I do is that I think when the case gets very controversial, people lose sight of the fact that this started out with average workers who are human beings like all the rest of us, want to be able to go to their job, do their work, collect their pay, feel good about their employer, and go home. They don't want to fight a battle every day of the week about, can I avoid this situation that is really awful. Now, this letter came in well after everything has settled down. But I think the message here is an organization that can't maintain an open, fair workplace will not attract and retain the best talent because people will not stay there. Some of them will stay and try to make it work, but many will just leave and say this is a bad place to work. And you'll never know about those people. You'll just keep turning over people all the time. And I think the instructive thing here is it's not just sexual harassment that drives people out of places to work, but it does absolutely happen that if you keep putting people through situations that are untenable, they will eventually say, you know what, I may love the work I'm doing, but the place is not a good place to be, and they will move on. And I think this really tells the story of what it's like for the individual. Never mind the politics, the church, the board, the globe, never mind all of that. This is what it's like for the actual person who's going through this. So, okay, any more questions? Yes.
Yes, how is he now, the CEO? What's he doing?
Well, the question is, where is Dr. Gagnon? You know, as you can imagine, I'm not in communication. But I don't think he's working right now, which is a shame because he's a well-trained physician and a very capable.
So we benefited, we got you as every person.
Well, thank you for that. Betty?
Helen, what about your relations with the board of directors? Have some of them come forward and said we're writing Helen?
Are you talking about the Board of Governors at Caritas Christi? Yes, my relationships with the Board of Governors at Caritas Christi. A number of them stepped forward and said, I'm really glad you did what you did. A number of them did. Not every single one by any means, but a number of them did. The first one to do so, or the first two to do so, were the religious on the board. They were great, incredibly supportive. Over time, I stayed for 2 additional years, and I will tell you, and I have to say, we all have to make these determinations on our own. It was very difficult, the first 6 or 7 months. After that, actually, it got easier. And my strategy was just to nose down, do your work, and just keep going, and try to remain as uncontroversial as possible. And I will say I had a great relationship with the succeeding CEO, and did some excellent work there. So I do think there's life after this. Would I have been promoted to some higher level of responsibility? Who knows? Probably not. That's my guess. Yes?
How did the board of governors justify the decision? Was it because of the
Yes. They never justified it to me. I do believe that they believed it was 4 cases. I think when they realized that it was some potentially larger number, we didn't know how large a number, it went out of control. Yes. Excuse me? Yes, he did. 10 months of sentence. Yes.
How did this whole episode and all the publicity affect the hospital and the organization?
Well, I think that's a great question. How did it affect the hospital organization? I would say that by and large, it was yet another opportunity for a Catholic organization to feel bad about itself in the eyes of the city. And that's just really not fair. I mean, that's another reason why you don't want to do this to an organization. I will say, I think that there was no impact whatsoever on the business. The business didn't decline or anything like that. I think the patients knew that they were getting great care and that they would continue to get great care. So that was fantastic. I will say, the head of HR is not typically the natural ally of the unions. But I was invited to speak at the Massachusetts Nurses Association annual association meeting afterwards. I think it's perhaps the first time someone in the management has been asked to do so, because these issues cross lines of union, non-union, and they get down to basic fairness in the workplace. So, actually, I think the organization has healed very well from all of this. Any other questions? Yes?
Didn't they end up selling Caritas?
They tried. It's interesting because they tried twice, but they were unsuccessful. It's interesting when you think about Keene going through a sexual harassment incident and then ultimately selling, and Caritas Christi going through a sexual harassment incident and then trying to sell but being unsuccessful. We have Caritas Christi has new management now, and I think doing a great job. So, yes, sorry.
Is there any movement within business schools, lawyers groups by CEOs, or any of our political candidates who have been referred about to be aware of how this unconscious exceptionalism comes to play in their minds, that they think they can do this for real big
exceptionalism, where I think your notion is that it's not going to be me, it's not going to happen to me. I don't know the answer to that specific question. I do know that many business schools, including our own School of Management, are working very hard to integrate ethics into the whole curriculum as appropriate, with the notion that if you train people from the beginning, hopefully by the time they have that level of responsibility, they learned it early and often. I hope that's true. In the grand scheme of things, I have great faith in the American business scene, and I think in spite of all the things, the bad things that we talked about this morning, they truly are the exception, not the rule. But they're bad exceptions, and they cause us to create rules for all of us, like the Sarbanes-Oxley rules, which have been a significant burden for many, many companies. But they came out of a series of problems that there didn't seem to be any other solution to. Yes?
How old was this guy?
At the time, 56, I believe, years old. 55, 56. Any other questions? Thank you. You've been great.